Okay, so are these little guys an accessory, a necessity, maybe a little bit of both? Today we're talking AR-15 muzzle devices. Episode 3 coming at you. It's muzzle brakes, muzzle compensators, flash hiders, linear compensators. By the time you stack up all these different muzzle device designs from the sea of manufacturers out there, you wind up with a literal mountain of these things. So where do you start when you try to find the right one for your AR-15? Well, when you boil it down to the basics, there's really only 3 choices you need to make. Do you want to reduce the recoil you feel? Do you want to overcome the natural muzzle rise after shooting to get back on target quicker? Or do you want to hide that fireball muzzle flash in low light conditions? So when I tell you that this is a muzzle brake, this is a muzzle compensator, and this is a flash hider, it's pretty obvious which one accomplishes one of those 3 jobs, but today's focus is on how they do it and why you would pick one over the other, or maybe even pick up something completely different altogether, like a hybrid of these. All right, let's start from the beginning. What are muzzle devices and what are they trying to solve? Simply put, a muzzle device is an attachment that you thread onto the end of your barrel to manipulate the massive amount of energy in the form of gases escaping your muzzle after you squeeze off a round. Why would you need to manipulate those gases? Well, that kind of starts with where muzzle devices originated from in the first place. Okay, so here's today's 2-cent history lesson. From the dawn of big firepower, aka cannons and artillery, recoil has been an issue to deal with. As our understanding of recoil evolved, so did the technology to control and mitigate it. From the heavy firepower on the ground to heavy firepower driving around the battlefield, the giant muzzle brake developed to help reduce that massive kick inside of smaller and smaller compact areas. So ultimately that technology worked its way down to the ground troops in their crew-served and individual rifles. But as we're about to find out, not only were muzzle devices very effective on those individual weapons, but further testing and engineering would finally lead to the muzzle devices we see today. So you've got your muzzle brakes, muzzle compensators, and flash hiders. These are the big 3 main muzzle device types out there, and each has its own purpose. Reduce the recoil you feel, compensate for the natural muzzle rise, and reduce the bright flash of burning gases. Starting with some common parts of all 3 muzzle devices, you'll find a female threaded end to fasten to your barrel's muzzle. For the standard 5.56, 223 muzzles and compatible AR variants, those threads will almost always be standardized at a 1/2x28 thread. If you remember from last week's barrel episode, that 1/2 inch meaning 1/2 inch outside diameter of the threads, and 28 meaning 28 threads in total. Not too far from those AR variants, you'll also see muzzle devices with larger thread diameters, most commonly 5/8x24 for larger chamberings. Traveling a little further up from the threads, most muzzle devices you'll see will have some wrench flats. Those are there to give your armorers or torque wrench something to grab onto to torque it down. Actually, there are several muzzle device styles out there that won't have wrench flats, where instead you might use a screwdriver or a punch or other tool to tighten them to torque. If you're like me, my choice is a muzzle device with wrench flats. One, because I'd probably bend or break a screwdriver trying to wrench on the other style, but most importantly, nearly every time a muzzle device that has wrench flats, those wrench flats will perfectly line up with the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock position when properly timed or aligned. So beyond wrench flats, almost all muzzle devices will have some sort of empty space or chamber that allows the gases to collect and redirect through holes, slits, gaps, vents, or whatever the manufacturer uses for gas manipulation. Just keep in mind that 80 to 90% of the time, that gas manipulation will be for one of those 3 things: reducing recoil, compensating for muzzle rise, or suppressing the brightness of the muzzle flash. And mind you, all of this is happening in just fractions of a second. Lastly, on muzzle device parts, the tip, every single one of them will have some kind of opening at the end because the bullet needs to come out. But that's really where the similarities start to deviate. Muzzle brakes, more often than not, have a tapered or somewhat closed tipped that are often larger or slightly larger than the bore of the barrel, while on the opposite end, flash hiders are almost always identifiable by their wide open tip. Muzzle compensators often are a toss-up depending on who is manufacturing them, but there are a lot more other ways to tell them apart, so let's jump into each one individually. Starting with muzzle brakes first, these are all about managing that recoil, and by managing, we're talking about pumping the brakes on that AR slamming back into your shoulder. Some might chuckle a bit about the recoil from a standard 5.56 223 AR-15, but that's typically why you hear it called recoil impulse or felt recoil, because at the end of the day, my wife, my daughter, and me, we all feel recoil differently. Okay, so how do these muzzle brakes work? Well, there is a really nerdy side about physics, propulsion, laws of motion, all that jazz, but at its simplest form, all the burning gases and the energy that they produce comes shooting out of the end of the long tube or your barrel. Naturally, that explosion of energy is going forward downrange, forces your entire AR back into your shoulder. Here's where the muzzle brake comes in. You can see that there are very large openings at the 9 o'clock and the 3 o'clock position. The point of these wide open ports is to allow a large amount of explosive gases to escape out the left and right side of the muzzle instead of just the tip, which dramatically reduces the recoil of your AR due to the gas propellant now being more evenly dispersed 180 degrees rather than straight out of the muzzle. Of course, muzzle brake design has done some evolving over the years where instead of just a couple large holes on the side, some are milled or drilled backwards at an angle slightly towards the shooter that acts as a slight counter propulsion against the natural propulsion that drives into your shoulder. Actually, this helps reduce that recoil impulse even further. So muzzle compensators, they do just that. They compensate for the natural rise of your muzzle after each shot. Like I said, that physics rabbit hole gets pretty deep here, but basically your AR isn't only pushing straight back into your shoulder with recoil, it's also pushing your barrel upwards due to the dynamics behind the contact points where you're holding your AR and how they're positioned below the center line of the barrel. The takeaway here on muzzle comps is that muzzle rise is inevitable, and if your goal is to send accurate shots downrange as quickly as possible, one after the other, compensating for that rise will be key to using a muzzle comp. How does it work though? Well, just like the ports on a muzzle brake, ports on a compensator, they redirect gases, except for in this case, rather than large ports at the 9 and 3 o'clock position, the muzzle comp uses smaller holes or ports at the top of the device to counter-propel the muzzle tip downward as gas leaves the top. Does that mean that compensators can take away every last bit of muzzle rise? The answer is a hard no, but for the accuracy-minded shooter, every little bit counts. Let's talk about flash hiders, and we can all guess what these guys do. They hide the muzzle flash. The military M16s of old were some of the first to use flash hiders, since firefights didn't just stop at dusk and pick back up at dawn. As you can imagine, and I'm sure you've seen over a ton of videos, firing in the dark really shows off that fireball effect coming out of the muzzle. Well, in the heat of the battle, if you think about it, that little flash of light also provides the perfect place for enemies to aim their next shot at. So to solve getting shot at in the dark, enter the flash hider design, either wide open at the end with 3 or more prongs, kind of like this one extending from the device, or more solid design like the A1 birdcage. It's got very large ports or openings, a full 360 degrees around. So the question is, how do they work? And basically, instead of a focused jet stream of burning gas leaving the end of your barrel, the flash hider's wide open ports disperse the gas and ensuing fireball as wide as possible in the shortest distance possible, ultimately breaking up that explosive gas cloud to the point where the bright flash is either heavily muted or not even existent at all. Either way, you're going to have to slap some kind of muzzle device onto your AR, but those aren't the only 3 to choose from. Today, there's a mountain of muzzle device designs that are either specialized only for recoil, muzzle rise, or flash, or they claim to do a combo of 2 or all 3 in one muzzle device. The question is are they effective at more than one job? Sure, there's some trade-off between doing one job great versus 2 jobs good enough, but probably the longest running and most popular device in that combo muzzle device group is the A2 birdcage. Not only does it have a large opening for hiding flash, but it was also designed with a closed bottom to overcome some sort of muzzle rise and also to keep some debris from kicking up when you're shooting in the prone. Through the evolution of muzzle devices, we've also seen tools like linear compensators like these, designed with the intent to reduce the sound blast and percussion traveling back to the shooter. It's sort of like turning the end of your garden hose sprayer from jet mode to spray mode, in which case, instead of propulsion coming from a single point out of the muzzle, it's broken up into multiple points facing downrange. Question is do they work as designed, and if so, how effectively? And I think that the jury is still kind of out on this one. You can find some decibel testing videos and articles with and without these types of compensators, these linear ones, but the truth is probably in the eye of the shooter. Let's talk about installing muzzle devices next, and this one begins with the topic of timing. You might have come across this term before with barrel nuts or earlier when I mentioned wrench flats, but the concept is pretty simple if you think of the end of your muzzle as a clock, where as you tighten your device, you also travel around the clock. With that in mind, almost all muzzle devices are directional, with the exception of most pure flash hiders, meaning that they not only need to be torqued to spec so they don't back up and fall off, but they also have to wind up in proper alignment or timing needed for them to function the way they were designed for. Think about your muzzle comp. The best part about getting timing right is that it's not very difficult at all with the help of a few spacers or washers. On that topic of spacers and washers, really there's only 4 most common types used to ensure that proper fit and timing or alignment of your muzzle device. Crush washer is by far the most common of the 4, probably because you just slap one on with that beveled edge facing downrange, then tighten down your muzzle device to squish or crush the washer until it's properly timed or aligned. This works because the shape and the softness of the crush washer allows it to deform as the muzzle device is tightened onto it, which creates this counter force that holds and locks the muzzle device threads into place. Jam nuts, on the other hand, thread onto the muzzle, and then it's followed by threading on the muzzle device behind it. Once you get the muzzle device close to fully tightened and timed, you can counter tighten the jam nut and the muzzle device into each other to lock them in place. One of the main benefits to a jam nut over a crush washer is that most of the time you can reuse them over and over again since they're not made to deform. But if crushing washers or jamming nuts doesn't work for you, there's also things like peel washers. Basically, peel washers are a stack of skinny washers that are smashed together where I can put the stack on, torque down my muzzle device, and if it isn't timed just perfectly, I pull everything off and I just peel a few of those thin washers off and put it back together until it lines up. Otherwise, you can use things like shims to achieve the same thing, with the exception that shims often come with different thicknesses, so you can mix and match to find the right alignment. The important part today is just at least understanding how that gas manipulation at the end of your barrel will affect your shooting, which also can dramatically change with your specific AR's gas system as a whole. Are you running a pistol, carbine, mid-length, or rifle gas system? Is your gas block fixed or adjustable? Did you align your gas block perfectly for reliable operation? Well, the journey into that AR-15 gas system as a whole starts in episode 4 right over here of the Ultimate AR-15 Beginner's Guide. So check it out and we'll see you over there.